Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 724, and today is December 9th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. There is a ton of news to get through on today's show. The fall of the Syrian government, Trump asking for a ceasefire in Ukraine, and the resignation of the South Korean president. But before I get into all that, I want to remind all of you to head on over to the brand new Kyle Anzalone show and subscribe to the channel. It is the very first link in the show notes page, so it's very easy to find. Just take 30 seconds, click the link, hit subscribe. We're already adding hundreds of subscribers to the channel, so it's going very well. We're putting out at least an episode a week. We're trying to do a little bit more. It's conflicts of interest, but a lot better. I have a production team behind me to help me ramp up the quality of the show and not having to do all the behind the scenes stuff while I'm actually recording the show. I think just helps the overall quality a little bit more, helps me to lay out my thoughts a little bit better. So I'm very excited about what we have going on over at the Kyle Anzalone show. And if all of you could go over and subscribe, it would make a big difference. We are trying to hit that 1,000 subscriber mark so we could start monetization and that kind of stuff. And if you do that, it will really help. We certainly have a big enough audience here at Conflicts of Interest to get at least 1,000 subscribers over at the Kyle Anzalone show. So again, if you haven't done so yet, please just take 30 seconds, head on over, hit the subscribe button, and then enjoy the rest of this show. All right, so my first article here I wrote yesterday for the Libertarian Institute. Trump calls for immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. President-elect Donald Trump demanded an immediate ceasefire and negotiations to begin in Ukraine. Trump made the remarks on Truth Social shortly after meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. So Trump wrote on Sunday, likewise, Zelensky and Ukraine would like to make a deal and stop the madness. They have ridiculously lost 400,000 soldiers and many more civilians. There should be an immediate ceasefire and negotiations should begin. Too many lives so needlessly wasted, too many families destroyed, and if it keeps going, it can turn into something much bigger and far worse. I know Vladimir well. This is his time to act. China can help. The world is waiting. And so this does seem like a little bit of good news. We have the president expressing a need for a ceasefire and also realizing just the problems with war, that a lot of people end up getting killed. Families are destroyed. Entire countries are destroyed, right? This is what Trump is saying. He sounds a little bit empathetic when he makes these kind of remarks. And that's certainly a good thing. It would be great to have a president that actually cared about the Ukrainian people. The Biden administration has made it very clear that their policy in Ukraine is about weakening Russia. It's not about helping the Ukrainian people at all. In fact, we have a great article today at antiwar.com on the page by Ted Snyder, basically saying that one day the Ukrainians may wake up to this fact that they were essentially used, that they gave their lives for the American empire, not for Ukraine, not for Ukrainian territory or sovereignty, not for Zelensky, but so Joe Biden could leave office saying that he weakened Russia and left Russia in a weakened state. That's what the Ukrainians are dying for at this point. Now, Trump says 400,000 soldiers lost. I don't know where he got that number. I saw a lot of people kind of focusing on it. It's interesting that he says that after he meets with Zelensky. I think it's possible that, maybe you have Joe Biden or Antony Blinken who have a little bit more discretion. And so when the Ukrainians let them know how many soldiers that they've lost, they won't actually publicly come out and say, where Donald Trump is just typing on Truth Social and it all comes out. But I have no idea if that's an accurate number or not. It could be all made up. It could be the number that Zelensky gave Trump and the real number is something different, or it could be the actual truth. We just don't know. So back to my article here. On the campaign trail, Trump told the American people he would bring the war in Ukraine to an end within 24 hours of taking office without laying out his plan. Since getting elected, he has appointed a slew of Russia hots to his incoming administration. His national security advisor, Mike Waltz, and his envoy to the Ukraine conflict, Keith Kellogg, have each endorsed the outgoing Joe Biden administration decision to significantly escalate the war in Ukraine by allowing Kiev to conduct long-range strikes inside Ukraine. And so I want to take a second to emphasize this point. And I think in this case, probably Keith Kellogg's position is slightly more important than Mike Waltz's. Who knows what Trump is going to have Waltz do once he actually becomes the national security advisor. And it seems pretty clear that Kellogg will be the person that is trying to work with the Russians, the Ukrainians, to bring about an end to this conflict. And for all of Trump's calls for an immediate ceasefire, if his administration, if the people that he is putting in the position to actually do the negotiating are saying that we're going to significantly escalate this war, that's our plan. We're going to threaten the Russians. We're going to tell the Russians we'll give the Ukraine any weapons they want if you're not willing to negotiate with Ukraine. And I'm not sure Russia's going to respond so well to being threatened that way. I don't think that's going to be the way the war ends. And so, again, it's great that Trump is saying this. I hope that he really means it, that he really wants to bring this war to an end, that he's seen pictures of dead Ukrainians, of Ukrainian widows and children weeping over their husband's casket. And that's really going to make, and realize that the next thing that Ukraine could do is start to draft their 18 to 25-year-olds to keep this war going. Maybe Trump would really be so horrified by that and really wouldn't want all that killing. And even when he has Waltz, Rubio, Kellogg, and the rest of these hots in his administration trying to convince him, Mr. President, what you need to do now is you need to make it really hard on Vladimir Putin. You need to tell him that you're going to crack down with all those sanctions and you're going to send all the weapons to Ukraine and you're going to get real tough with that Russian president. And then he's going to give you exactly the best deal the Ukrainians could get, a deal that Biden could never get. And you're going to do it because you're so. If that's the message that Trump is hearing, I think it's very likely that he believes it. And we don't actually see the war in Ukraine end under his administration. You have what he posts on Truth Social, which are probably the president's true feelings. But if you have him appoint all these hots around him, then even if that is his true feeling, it may not, actually manifest into a policy. So back to my article here. On Saturday, Trump met with Zelensky in France. Following Trump's post, Zelensky wrote on social media, "I stated what we needed, a just and enduring peace, one that the Russians will not be able to destroy in a few years, as they have repeatedly done in the past." And so I think what Zelensky is referring to there is his demand to become a member of the NATO alliance, which just is a complete non-starter for Russia. And that's the demands that the Ukrainians and therefore the Americans are placing at, demanding of Vladimir Putin. I don't think he's going to find a very willing negotiating partner in Moscow. So Trump also gave an interview to Meet the Press that aired over the weekend, where he said he expected NATO members to spend more on their militaries. He said they had to pay their bills, adding he would absolutely think about withdrawing America from the alliance if they didn't. This is something he said in his first administration. I don't take it too seriously. I know there were a lot of people within the Beltway that were up in arms over these remarks. Some of Trump's supporters were very excited and celebrating these remarks. And look, they would be something to celebrate if there was any reason to think that Trump was genuine about them. All right, next up here, this one from our friend Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, December 8th. Biden administration announces nearly $1 billion weapons package for Ukraine. On Saturday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced the U.S. would be providing Ukraine with a new weapons package worth nearly $1 billion. The package, which is $988 million, is being provided through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the U.S. to purchase weapons for Ukraine. According to the Pentagon, the weapons package includes ammunition for HIMARS, drones, equipment, components, and spare parts to maintain, repair, and overhaul artillery systems, tanks, and armored vehicles. Austin announced the new military aid in remarks at the Regional National Defense Forum, where he called for the incoming administration to build on what the Biden administration had done. Austin said, "So the baton will soon be passed and others will decide the course ahead, and I hope they will build on the strength that we had forged over the past 4 years." The Biden administration has been working to ship as many weapons to Ukraine as possible before Trump is inaugurated. In recent months, President Biden signed off on several significant escalations in the proxy war, including supporting long-range strikes on Russian territory and the provision of widely banned anti-personnel mines to Ukraine. Biden officials have also been calling for Ukraine to lower the conscription age from 25 to 18, so younger Ukrainians are set to fight. Biden asked Congress for an additional $24 billion to spend on the proxy war, but Mike Johnson said he wouldn't take up, that's the Speaker of the House, would not take up the decision before Trump is in office. And so, this Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, those weapons do not always go to Ukraine immediately. And so the Pentagon is going to, place contracts with Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, whoever else makes the weapons that they're going to be giving to the Ukrainians. And maybe these companies have some in stock that they could go ahead and sell. If not, they're going to have to manufacture them. And so it's going to take an amount of time before they're actually given to the Ukrainians. And I think this is another way that the Trump proofing of the aid is going to work, where Trump has kind of said that his leverage over the Ukrainians is going to be telling them that they need to negotiate or they risk losing U.S. assistance. Well, if Zelensky is sitting on a pile of $10-15 billion of U.S. weapons, or at least has them lined up to enter the country from NATO, from Poland, and other places, then he may not feel like he has to cave to those demands from Trump. And if you wait 6 months, then the status quo is going to change, and Trump may be no longer so hard line in his demand that Ukraine negotiate to continue to receive American weapons. And, to essentially crack the president's policy to end the war that way. All right, next up here, South Korean President Yoon to resign. So the party of South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol said he will step aside after his failed attempt to evoke martial law last week. The People's Power Party leader Han Dong-hoon expressed that Yoon would resign sometime soon and would cease all official business immediately. Through the orderly early resignation of the president, we will minimize the confusion to South Korea and its people, stability, resolve and the political situation, and recover liberal democracy. Even before his resignation, the president will not be involved in any state affairs, including diplomacy. Han said and he said this along with Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, he would help govern Seoul through the transition of power. During a joint presser, the two leaders stressed the importance of South Korea maintaining a strong military relationship with the U.S. and Japan. Yoon's downfall started Tuesday night when he declared martial law. The South Korean parliament quickly voted against the order, and Yoon retracted his declaration. The opposition Democratic Party held an impeachment vote to remove Yoon from office, which he survived with the backing of his PPP. Yoon then apologized for invoking martial law and did not discuss his resignation. The Democratic Party is also calling for the president's arrest. The opposition is saying that Yoon and his PPP are not living up his commitment to step away from official duties as he accepted his interior minister's resignation. The exclusion of President Yoon from duties was a blatant lie, the Democratic Party said in a statement, where the PPP shot back and said that, well, this is something that is not really official business, is just a rubber stamp. So we will see what comes, but I do think that Yoon is going to be shortly stepping aside here. All right, next up, U.S. denies Amnesty's conclusion that Israel is committing genocide. So the U.S. on Thursday rejected a 296-page report from Amnesty International that concludes Israel is conducting a genocide in Gaza. So State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel told reporters, "We disagree with the conclusions of such a report. We have previously and continue to find that the allegations of genocide are unfounded." U.S. officials have repeatedly denied the idea that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, since it would implicate them due to the massive amount of U.S. military aid that the U.S. has provided to Israel over the past year. Amnesty is calling for the U.S. and other countries that supply arms to Israel to end the weapons shipments to avoid being complicit in the genocide. So the Secretary General of Amnesty said, states that continue to transfer arms to Israel at this time must know they are violating their obligation to prevent genocide and they are at risk of becoming complicit in the genocide. All states with influence over Israel, particularly key arms suppliers, the USA and Germany, but also EU member states, the UK and others, must act now to help bring Israel's atrocities against the Palestinians to an immediate end. The U.S. is by far the largest arms supplier, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SPIRI, found that between 2019 and 2023, the U.S. provided Israel with 69% of its weapons, and Germany accounted for 30%. The U.S. State Department has also denied that there is evidence that Israel is committing war crimes with U.S. weapons to ensure that the arms could continue to flow. Amnesty investigated 15 Israeli airstrikes in Gaza that took place between October 7th and April 20th. In those strikes, Amnesty found no evidence that there were any military targets, and said that at least 334 civilians, including 141 children, were killed. Patel was asked about the 15 airstrikes examined by Amnesty and deferred to the Israeli military. I will defer to the IDF to speak to its specific military operations, which is what happens every time. They bring it would be like somebody compiles evidence that somebody murdered their child or something like that, and they take it to the police, and all the evidence is there, and the police go, oh, you should go ask the guy that you're saying murdered them out. What do you want us to do about it? Oh, why should we get involved in any of this business whatsoever? We have nothing to do with this, and nothing wrong is happening here. Talk to the Israelis, who are going to deny it. So that's the U.S. policy. It's absolutely disgusting, but that is what's going on. The Israeli Foreign Ministry also responded to the report on Thursday, claiming it was a fabricated report that is entirely false and based on lies, and called Amnesty International a deplorable and fanatical organization, which is not. It's one of the main human rights organizations. And a lot of times, Amnesty reports are used by the U.S. government to justify their interventions abroad. All right, let's get into the fall of Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government. I wrote this article. This one's actually a viewpoint or an op-ed. It's up at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute today. It's titled, Washington Celebrates Al-Qaeda's Victory in Syria. Washington finally completed its dirty war in Syria. What started as a CIA covert operation to smuggle weapons and jihadists from Libya to Syria has resulted in the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad being deposed and replaced by Abu Mohammed al-Jolani. Jolani found his way to Damascus by rising through the ranks of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Inspired by the 9/11 attack, he joined AQI to fight against the U.S. during the Iraq War. Jolani was a close associate of both AQI leader Abu Musab al-Zawahiri and founded the Al-Qaeda affiliate group in Syria in coordination with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. As more Americans became aware of the CIA's covert influence operation in Syria to bat jihadists, Jolani changed his organization's name from al-Nusra to Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, and then finally Harat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, to obscure the group's Al-Qaeda links. However, HTS is no moderate group, and when it rebranded from JFS to HTS, one of the big parts of that rebranding and those, that change of names was also changing to absorb more of the ISIS fighters that had had no home after the fall of the ISIS caliphate. And so once ISIS is, diminished and defeated 2016, 2017, 2018, then some of these fighters start to drift back into HTS. And so HTS, as presented by the American mainstream media, I saw Charles Lister doing this a lot, is supposed to be Jolani moving away from Al-Qaeda and all these other things. In reality, it was about him absorbing more jihadist fighters into his ranks. So even the U.S. State Department was not fooled by Jolani's rebrands. In 2017, the State Department issued a $10 million reward for the capture of Jolani. For most of the past decade, Jolani has ruled over northwestern Syria under the protection of Washington's NATO ally Turkey. Had Turkish troops not set up outposts surrounding Jolani's territory, Syria and its Russian, Iranian, and Hezbollah allies may have eliminated the lingering jihadist threat. During this period, Jolani's Idlib province was the largest safe haven for jihadists on the planet. Since the ISIS caliphate was defeated, the front lines in the Syrian civil war largely froze. Still, Washington and its allies engaged in a relentless assault on Damascus. Turkey protected jihadists on Syria's northern border, allowing them to terrorize the Kurds that lived there. Israel engaged in weekly airstrikes on Assad and his allies. Over the past year, those strikes have escalated to hit civilian and diplomatic targets in downtown Damascus. Tel Aviv even bombed the Aleppo airport following a major earthquake, preventing aid from reaching its desperate civilians. The U.S. illegally occupied the eastern quarter of Syria, exploiting and stealing some of Damascus's most valuable resources. In this region, the U.S. allowed the Kurds to lord power over the local Arabs. The Kurdish SDF runs a massive torture prison in the area, known as the Al-Hol camp, and local civilians protest regularly the Kurds conscripting their children, including girls as young as the age of 15. Washington waged an economic war on Syria deliberately meant to prevent Damascus from rebuilding its war-destroyed infrastructure. The U.S. also bombed Assad's allied forces near the Iraq-Syria border. Additionally, Turkey and Ukraine used this period to bolster the HTS forces. And so I want to go over and break all this down a little bit more, because I think when we look at what ultimately happened in the fall of Bashar al-Assad, there's going to be, I think, a death by 1,000 cuts narrative where it's all these little things that are happening as the war in Syria is largely frozen, and most people assume that Bashar al-Assad is going to be the ultimate winner of the conflict. You know, he held Damascus, he held Dara, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, and had the backing of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. And so, you know, for everything working in Assad's favor, I think when those battle lines were frozen, people eventually assumed that the Russians and the Syrians would get to mopping up the HTS, the al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda forces in Idlib, and then the Kurds who are, you know, under U.S. protection and U.S. occupation in the area east of the Euphrates River would eventually make a deal with Bashar al-Assad for a couple of reasons. One, because Turkey has continued to encroach on their territory, and if you're a Kurd, you much rather be ruled by Assad than by Erdogan. Erdogan has waged a lot of wars against the Kurds and is very brutal to his own Kurdish minority, and again has facilitated some of these jihadists and other Syrian rebels moving into Kurdish territories, particularly the territory of Afrin, which was a Kurdish enclave in northern Aleppo, was completely, from my understanding, ethnically cleansed of the Kurds by these Turkish bad forces. And so, look, you know, even if Turkey is doing this to the Kurds, it still, of course, undermines Damascus and Assad, as he cannot protect his own people from a neighboring country that's invading his territory. I think the Israeli weekly strikes on Assad probably have far more of an impact than anybody could really imagine. I mean, the humiliation of constantly coming under attack from an enemy that you have no ability to fight back against must have been really demoralizing for Assad's forces. Imagine if you know, you're a commander in Assad's army of some kind, and every single week another one of your fellow commanders is killed. Maybe you think about leaving the country, because Assad cannot protect you. He can change the status quo to prevent the Israeli strikes in any way. And so, again, you know, this is just a death by 1,000 cuts situation where the Syrian army is slowly degraded by these Israeli airstrikes. And again, I think morally degraded as well. Of course, nothing in this article or nothing I'm saying on this show is meant to be an endorsement of Bashar al-Assad. He had a lot of policies that I disagreed with, merely that he's preferable, particularly to Americans, than Al-Qaeda ruling Damascus. But one of the things that Assad did that I really didn't like was he had a pretty broad conscription policy. And so if you look, there's a lot of people that have fled Syria over the years and were Libyan refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, or another country, simply out of fear of being conscripted into Assad's army. And again, this is something that I'm sure had quite a big effect. Also, Hezbollah having to pull so many of their fighters into southern Lebanon and the beating that they have taken over the past year from Israel, no doubt had some impact on Assad's quick demise. The U.S. economic war, also another huge factor in all this, deliberately meant to prevent Assad from rebuilding his territory. For the people of Syria, this might be something that really makes you turn against your leader if he cannot rebuild the country after a war. And it's not that you necessarily support the opposition, that you support Al-Qaeda, just that, it causes a loss in confidence in Assad. And additionally, the U.S. constantly occupying this third or quarter of Syria that they hold east of the Euphrates River, stealing a lot of Syria's most valuable food and natural resources, oil and things like that, I'm sure also has contributed to the inability to rebuild, also the constant humiliation that Assad faces. Additionally, I have here the Turkey and Ukraine bolstering the HTS forces. This seems to at least have been a part of the explanation for why the Syrian armies fell so quickly, and that was the HTS forces were using new drones, and they were just taking out the Syrian forces before they were able to really mount a defense. And so again, this, if you can't see what's going to kill you and you're not exactly in love with your country anyway, then if you're ordered to the front lines to go fight against terrorists, will you go fight? It seems like a lot of Syrian troops must not have done so. All right, so back to my article here. The long-frozen conflict thawed rapidly over the past 2 weeks. Seemingly in coordination with the announcement of a truce in Lebanon, Jolani's forces went on the march, first seizing Aleppo. Reported to be aided by advanced drones, HTS made quick work of Syrian forces that resisted, and on Sunday, Jolani arrived in Damascus and declared the Mujahideen had won the war, and Washington celebrated. So this is Josh Rogan from the Washington Post, what he wrote on X. Syria is free. The rebels won. The people liberated themselves from tyranny. Freedom won. Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and Assad lost. Historic. The road ahead for Syria won't be easy, but it will be better than it was in the past. The world should celebrate Syria's liberation and help it succeed. Now, this is just completely bonkers. Al-Qaeda won the war, and he's saying freedom won. The people are liberated. What the hell are you talking about? Who gets liberated when Al-Qaeda takes over your country? Are the Libyans liberated? Look at what happened to them. That's the best example that you could draw between what happened to Syria is what happened in Libya when they deposed Muammar Gaddafi. And look, yeah, Gaddafi, brutal dictator, bad guy, don't like him. He wasn't a terrorist, and he was able to hold the Libyan state together. At least when Gaddafi was in charge of Libya, there wasn't an Islamic caliphate in Libya, and yet that's something that happened in Libya after Gaddafi was deposed. And so to declare this a victory, to be good for freedom, to be good for liberty, to be good for Americans is just simply stupid. And Washington Post columnist Matt Spoot also repeats that stupidity in the post he wrote. Assad, after a quarter century of ruthless rule, has fled the country. Syria was free at last. And then neocon Bill Kristol wrote on X, the fall of Assad on some days one can believe that while the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends towards justice. And so again, the whole point that all these men are making is that this is a good, just, and moral thing for the Syrians and for us as Americans too, which just is completely absurd. Look, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, whoever you want to name as a part of the axis of resistance, people on the official enemies list that we're constantly told that we have to fight, that we have to sanction, that we have to spend our blood and treasure to combat all these threats that they say are out there. None of them, want to come to America and harm Americans. That's not the goal of the Iranians. That's not the goal of the Russians. That certainly was never the goal of Bashar al-Assad, who couldn't even retake his own territory. He couldn't even attack the 900 Americans that were occupying Syria. And yet we're going to pretend that it's somehow a great victory for Americans that a guy who couldn't even remove Americans from his own country is deposed in favor of a guy who is a jihadist, who wants to conduct attacks on American soil. He loved 9/11. After 9/11, he was inspired to go fight. You know, not like the Americans, right? The Americans who are inspired to go fight, you know, for the 3,000 dead Americans who were killed on 9/11. He did in celebration of the 3,000 Americans who were killed on 9/11. It's beyond disgusting that we would, you know, go as far as to celebrate this. And why? It's because they say it weakened Moscow, Tehran, and Hezbollah. Well, maybe we'll see in the long term if that really is the case here. Maybe this is ultimately just them cutting loose somebody who was actually weighing on them. You know, there's this mythical land bridge between Iran and southern Lebanon that ran through Iraq and Syria that they said was, you know, responsible for Hezbollah being so strong. Well, I'm sure Iran is going to find other ways to get weapons to Lebanon. This isn't like some unique thing that they could only drive them. Their ships and other ways to get things to southern Lebanon from Iran. So all their supposed victories are just absolute jokes and stupidity. And in reality, this is only a win for Al-Qaeda. So, of course, what happened to Syria is not about the Syrians. The real goal of Washington was to weaken Damascus because they believed it would weaken Moscow, Tehran, and Hezbollah. So just like the war in Ukraine isn't about the Ukrainians, it's about trying to weaken Russia. And it's not even about trying to weaken Russia. It's about trying to weaken China. And so all this is just, you know, the most absurd reasoning to carry out these absolutely ruthless and stupid policies that are going to plague and leave so many Syrians dead and destitute and just in horrific situations. So what happens next in Syria is unlikely to be good for many of the minority groups that enjoyed some level of protection under Assad. However, Washington and its allies are swooping in like hungry vultures to feast on the remains of Syria. Shortly after Assad left Damascus, in Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced Israel would be seizing a buffer zone in southwestern Syria. Turkey also launched airstrikes on a Kurdish-held city in northern Syria. No doubt in the coming days, it will become we will hear crowing from the hawks in Washington about their triumph in Syria by severing Tehran's alleged land connection to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. In the White House, Biden's staff is no doubt discussing how they are going to exploit Assad's downfall as far as possible. This includes attempting to remove Russia from its military bases along Syria's Mediterranean coast. The biggest losers in Syria are the Syrian people who, for nearly a decade and a half, have been subject to a brutal and complex war that shows no sign of ending. They have been bombed by a seemingly unending number of countries, all with their own unique geopolitical interests. The Syrian people have been intentionally starved and impoverished by the U.S. to bring about Assad's downfall. While Assad was a tyrant, no doubt Jolani will come with his own and likely more oppressive tyranny. Among the other losers are the American people. More American lives and treasure were wasted on a project to depose another Middle East dictator. In Iraq and Libya, the policy caused unimaginable suffering for the locals. The top threat is that our government has empowered the only true enemies of the American people: Iran, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and Assad, Syria, etc., all presented no threat to the American homeland. However, now that Al-Qaeda terrorist sits on the throne in Damascus and Washington's support for Tel Aviv's genocide in Gaza has given him an endless supply of anti-American hatred. And so, yeah, I think this situation in Syria is really bad. All right, I do want to mention here just a couple more quick stories dealing with Syria. So, this one I really mentioned in my article. I just want to note it again that Netanyahu takes credit for Assad's overthrow and Israel seizes the Golan Heights buffer zone. And so far, they've taken the buffer zone territory. And if you look on this map, if you're watching the show, you could kind of see this stretch of territory that they've now taken that was once monitored by the United Nations. I would not be surprised if Israel ends up going farther. They have bombed quite a few Syrian military bases as well. President Biden said Assad's fall is a fundamental act of justice. And so he sounds just like Josh Rogan, Matt Spoot, and Bill Kristol. And then the last story here, this one I did want to go through a little bit. Russia says armed groups have guaranteed the security of Russia's bases in Syria. So a source in the Kremlin has told Russian media that militants who have overthrown Bashar al-Assad have guaranteed the security of Russian military bases in the country. Russian officials are in touch with representatives of the armed Syrian opposition, whose leaders have guaranteed security of Russian military bases and diplomatic missions on Syrian territory. Militants led by Tahrir al-Sham, an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, launched an offensive in Syria against Russia's ally Assad on November 27th and quickly took over the capital. The Kremlin source also told TASS that Assad has fled to Moscow for asylum. Assad and his family have arrived in Moscow. Russia has granted asylum to them, proceeding from humanitarian considerations. Earlier, the Russian foreign minister confirmed that Assad had decided to flee Syria. The ministry insisted Russia was not involved in the talks that led to Assad leaving, but said that was in contact with the opposition. And so it'll be interesting to see how all this, kind of plays out over the coming weeks and what we learn. Really, what happened with Bashar al-Assad? Did he maybe upset some of his benefactors in Moscow and Tehran and Beirut? And that was at least part of the reason why his forces collapsed so quickly. So many questions still to be answered here and so much left to play out. Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's show. We'll be back with more in the week, and don't forget to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show.